Hey guys, Mark here. It's great to be back. Sorry it's been such a long time since I was able to put out a video. Recently, the last couple months, my wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and so kind of been preoccupied with that. Both mom and baby are doing fantastic, and I'm doing well too. Thanks for asking. But if you would like, we'll put up an address at the end, and you can send gift cards to Target and Walmart and the such if you'd like. But just kidding. But today I wanted to talk briefly about a story that we find in John chapter 8. And the story has to deal with an interaction between Jesus and a woman that was caught in the act of adultery. And in summary, the story goes like this, is that Jesus, as he often did, was teaching to a group of people. And before long, a group of Pharisees and scribes, religious leaders, brought this woman to Jesus that was caught in the very act of adultery. In trying to entrap Jesus, they look at him and say, Jesus, this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her, but what do you say? After a few intense moments, Jesus stands up and looks and says, okay, whoever is without sin, let that person cast the first stone. The King James Version says that the accusers, the religious leaders, began to be convicted, and one by one, they began to walk away, beginning with the oldest. Jesus looked at the woman and said, where are your accusers? And she looked around and said, there's no one here to condemn me. And Jesus says, I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. I think there are multiple elements to the story, but I just really want to focus on a few. A lot of times when I read a narrative in the Bible, I try to put myself in that situation, in that environment, so I can begin to understand the reality of what's actually taking place. And what we know is that this woman was brought before Jesus, and we know that she's guilty. She was caught in the very act, and in addition, she doesn't make any plea that she's innocent. And so here she is, not only brought before Jesus, but brought publicly before a crowd of people. And so I can imagine her standing there with being completely embarrassed and shamed. And the thing is that she knows that she's guilty. So there she is, full of guilt, full of shame, full of embarrassment. And as a Jewish woman, her knowing the law, she knows that the repercussions of her actions are going to result in death. So I couldn't imagine how she was sitting there, not only being publicly shamed and standing there guilty, but to know that your life more than likely was about to end. So I picture her standing there before Jesus, and Jesus says something very profound, and I think it's something that we should look at. When he looks at the religious leaders, he says, whoever is without sin, let that person cast the first stone. What's interesting is that by Jesus' own criteria, no other person in the vicinity, in that crowd, could pick up a stone to begin the execution process except Jesus himself, him being the only one that was sinless. So Jesus could have started the execution process, but doesn't. He doesn't hand down condemnation or judgment, although he has the full right to. What we find is that he extends mercy and grace. And I can imagine that woman sitting there, not knowing how this day was going to end, all of a sudden sitting before Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and having him stand there without condemnation. Sometimes I think of myself or humanity in general as we stand before Christ, similar to the woman that was caught in the very act. There she was, as we were, standing there before God guilty, standing there with our shame and standing there with our embarrassment, waiting for a sentence to be passed down. Because we're all guilty. We've all been born into sin. So we stand there in our guilt. We have no defense. There's nothing that we can say to say that we were sinless or that we don't deserve this. We deserve everything that we get. And so I picture that moment where as we would stand before Christ going, I deserve anything that you would give me. I deserve death. I don't deserve life. And in turn to have the Savior of the world look at us and go, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. The powerful work of Jesus Christ in salvation. I think it's very key when we look at the order in which Jesus says things as well. Jesus doesn't look and say, I want you to first go and work on yourself so that you're not filled with sin anymore. Come back to me and then we'll talk about the process of you being condemned or not being condemned. The very onset of what he says is you're not condemned. And from that point, now go and live a sinless life. I think that's very purposeful that it was said that way. Jesus doesn't say, wow, I really saved you today. Now, in turn, what are you going to do for me? He doesn't hold it as some bargaining chip that when we stray from the path, that he goes, no. Remember when I saved you? Remember when I saved you? No, you owe me. He doesn't do that. Out of the foundation of grace and mercy and intimacy with Jesus Christ, we have been empowered to now go out and live a sinless life. An error that we make many times is that we try to clean ourselves up before approaching God. But the truth is that our righteousness will never appease the judgment that we have upon us, or our sentence of death that we have upon us because we are sinners. There is no way that you can become a better you so that you will somehow miraculously be more accepted by God. That's why that's why salvation and grace is a gift. Paul speaks and states that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. A very powerful a verse that is often been repeated over and over and over again, that sometimes we become numb to that fact, but it's absolute truth. That while we were standing there guilty, full of shame and full of guilt, that Jesus dies. And out of that moment, he accepts us and said, there's no condemnation. Now go from this point on and live a sinless life. Listen, when the foundation of the Christian life is not built upon the free gift of grace and salvation, there is no way to live out the life that God has intended us to live. It can't be done. A lot of times we try to correct our behavior and do the right things and practice to be the best Christians that we can. And while the motives are good, that can never be the foundation for what we are trying to accomplish and who we are. The foundation is always Jesus Christ himself, his redemption, his salvation. And when we move into that place of intimacy with him, and when we move into that place of accepting this free gift of grace, man, it empowers us to carry out our Christian walk. It allows us to move forward and not be a slave to sin. I know that there are multiple elements, and we'll probably discuss them later on in another video. But if you're here and you're watching this, just remember, God does not condemn you. From this moment on, he has extended grace and mercy to you. Now, go and sin no more. As always, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you soon.